In today's class, we're going to turn our attention to Tool 23 in Roy Peter Clark, and I call this the writer's tuning fork. So we've talked about writing as an act of perception, and we've focused on perception being seen. But hearing is also an act of perception. Writing involves hearing as well. So let's just use this class period and think about, what are you hearing with your ears? And connected to this is the idea of voice. So where does voice come from? What is the writer's voice? And voices comes out of both the kinds of themes, topics, subject areas that draw you, sort of the focus of where your interests lie. So in terms of looking at our last short essay and thinking about what are you going to write about for essay 5, I want you to look back at the essays you've written previously. Some of you have been already doing this. I mean, you're centered around a central topic. But look at it and think, oh, what really interests me? What do I see? What kind of subject? What kind of themes draw me to them? And this will be reflected in your voice. Choice of topic is a part of voice. But we're going to look at this a little more deeply and look at how even our writing choices, so the choice of topic first, but how our other writing choices result in a writer's voice. And what's really important, so remember, we're using our tuning fork, and this is the tool that's the tuning fork. It is the sound of your spoken voice. And that's why we're focusing in this class on reading work aloud, both the writing of another writer, a professional writer, and our own. And we're listening. You're going to be recording your oral readings, both of David Foster Wallace in Shipping Out and of your own writing. And then you're going to listen to those recordings. And this is very, very important. Where does voice come from? Well, as you listen to your recordings, you're going to hear voice. First, you're going to hear the voice of David Foster Wallace, and you're going to think about, what voice am I hearing? Who is this person behind the writing? And what makes him have such a distinctive voice in writing his essay about his cruise? And then as you listen to your own, listen to what you hear yourself reading. Listen to it aloud. What do you hear? And your classmates are going to have an opportunity to listen to you reading your own work as well. And you're going to have a chance to find out what they hear and compare it with what you think you hear. So this is important for two reasons. One is most developing, blooming writers have a, at best, tentative voice. They're in the process of developing voice. And as you listen to yourself reading aloud, as you listen to your writing, as it's read aloud, you're going to hopefully hear your voice. So that reading aloud is going to be a source of revealing your voice to you, perhaps in a way that you have not encountered before. The second goal of this exercise is for you to hear where it's not your voice coming out in your writing. It's somebody else's voice, or it seems to not have much personality or voice at all. Prefabricated language, as we talked about a couple classes ago, always results in a homogeneity of voice. It's an impersonalization of voice. And that's, again, one reason we want to avoid it. Because it's part of discovering and developing our individualized personal writing voice. So 2 things you're going to be listening for, 2 things are your focus in the exercises we're doing in class today. One is to hear yourself, to hear your own voice, to identify those attributes of your writing that are authentically yours, that belong to you, so you can step up and own them in a fuller way, in a more intentional way when you write Essay 5. And the second thing is to hear what is not your voice, what's coming from somewhere else, or what is failing to shape itself into any kind of voice at all. It may be like Siri reading your prose back to you. And to think, okay, where is that? What's causing that in my writing? Where is that coming from? And what can I do to replace that with my authentic voice? So with those 2 things in mind, let's look at where voice comes from in our writing. So the first place, one of the first factors that forms or shapes our voice is the level or register of the language used. So what do I mean by level or register? Well, is your voice, so you're going to talk about your nanny. What did nanny say? What did nanny do about that? Or are you going to say, thank God I'm a country boy? Okay? Those are examples of register, and they reflect your origins, which is something you want to own in your identity. Never be ashamed of where you are from. Your level of education. It can also reflect your audience. I always change the register of my voice depending on audience. So when I'm back in Southern Iowa, I'm down on the farm, and I'm in the community I grew up in. I always change the register of the language I use to fit the language, the common language, intonations, sentence structures of the people of that community, whom I might add I dearly love. Okay, so that's level or register. The second contributing factor to voice is one's favorite point of view. Point of view, in fact, is very important in creating voice. So an example of point of view would be someone who really likes to use the first person narrator. That usually communicates more immediacy, more presence, more personal interest in the topic, and therefore it flows over as the author being more personally interested in their audience. But also there's a place and a time for a third person narrator as well. It's which you prefer. So you'll have a preference here. Although you use, in your writing, you will move between different points of view from essay to essay. What's your preferred point of view? That's a very important key to voice. Thirdly, what kind of cultural allusions do you use when you write? For example, are you going to be quoting Dante or Ellen? Are you going to reference Oprah or Shakespeare in your writing? What's typical? And that also is a significant contributor, shaper, component of voice. Fourth, what kind of metaphors or literary devices do you use? And do these come naturally to you? So as you read your work and you listen to your work read, so you're listening to that oral reading of your work, think about it. Where are places where it's like, that just doesn't work? Why doesn't it work? Is it because I'm trying to sound too literary and that's not really who I am and where my writing voice, where my writing voice is strongest or most authentic? So think about those questions. I have a poetic bent, and I like to make my sounds flow like currents in a river, like droplets of water in a fountain. I like that sound. So that's part of who I am and part of who my voice. So even when I'm writing a research paper, something very dry, I'm always aware of how the consonantal sounds of the words I'm using flow together or don't flow together. And is there a word choice that creates that more musicality in the flow of those sounds, the words I'm using? Okay, fifth, sentence length and sentence structures. Are you using short sentences, long sentences? If you're using a mix, what's the mix like? Let me just say right now, if all of your sentences are about the same length, your voice is lost. That's not going to help you discover your voice. You need to experiment with using lots of little short sentences, punctuated by a long sentence now and then, or combining your sentences and using a string of longer sentences. And you need to use this class and use this next essay as an opportunity to experiment in this area to find your voice. Sentences and paragraphs of uniform length, that means, plus or minus 5 words difference in their length. Do not voice create. And likewise, sentence structures. So you're using complex sentences. That means you're using a lot of embedded sentences, an embedded clause, subordinate clauses, noun clauses, adjective clauses. You're using sentences within sentences within sentences. Or you're stringing sentences together with and but and or. You're using a lot of compound sentences. Or you like compound complex sentences. So you've got 2 sentences strung together with an and, and each one of those sentences has 3 or 4 complex sentences, clauses, subordinate clauses embedded in them. Some people, that is their authentic voice. And you need to discover that, and you need to work at perfecting what comes natural to you and what is authentic, what communicates, what contributes to strengthening and maturing that writer's voice. Tone. So Roy Peter Clark talks, he doesn't use the word tone. He describes it as being the distance from the topic, the level of neutrality. Well, that is communicated through tone. Is it a serious tone, which reflects investment in the topic? Is it sarcastic, which creates distance from the topic? Is it passionate? Now we're emotionally invested. We're not just mentally thinking, cognitively thinking, intellectually balancing the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses of 2 ideas or 2 positions, but we've committed to one. Or is it objective? So these are the facts. This is the way it is. This is reality. Heck, there's not much you can do about it. Or I'm not writing to motivate anyone to do anything. So tone is also a very important component of voice. And finally, narrative frames. And what do I mean by narrative frames? What does Roy Peter Clark mean by narrative frames? So these are the kind of ways you like to begin and end your essays. So if you go back and review the 4 essays you've written for this class already and look at the way that you're framing them, I know within the context of this class, I've been kind of pushing you to frame them within a anecdotal or story framework. So, maybe look at some of your writing that you've done outside of the class. Do you have a favorite way of starting an essay? Do you have a favorite way of ending an essay? What's your preferred frame for developing and presenting your thoughts. And remember, so keep all of the, when we look at all 7 of these, keep in mind that the way you're doing it now may not reflect your authentic voice. You may be doing something now, like beginning essays a certain way, that you need to change to bring your writing to strengthen your writing voice, develop its individuality more. Okay? So what we're going to do on this slide is I'm going to read you 2 passages, and I want you to think about those 7 aspects or attributes of writing voice. And as I read these, I want you to think about the writer's voice that you're hearing. So we're not analyzing content. I want you just to close your eyes and what's the voice of the person you're hearing. And I hope I can do this so you're not just hearing Dr. Graves' own idiosyncratic way of reading. Okay? Let's give it a whirl. The first passage is from Edward R. Murrow, a radio broadcaster who was on site when Buchenwald concentration camp was liberated by the Allies in 1945. We entered. It was floored with concrete. There were 2 rows of bodies stacked up like cordwood. They were thin and very white. Some of the bodies were terribly bruised, though there seemed to be little flesh to bruise. Some had been shot through the head, but they bled but little. All except 2 were naked. I tried to count them as best I could and arrived at the conclusion that all that was mortal of more than 500 men and boys lay there in 2 neat piles. Okay? I'm going to read it one more time. I want you to think about sentence length, sentence structures, point of view, narrative frame, cultural allusions, metaphors, literary devices, register, level of language being used, tone, okay? Think about these things. What are you hearing? And is there a distinctive voice coming out of this paragraph? We entered. It was floored with concrete. There were 2 rows of bodies stacked up like cordwood. They were thin and very white. Some of the bodies were terribly bruised, though there seemed to be little flesh to bruise. Some had been shot through the head, but they bled but little. All except 2 were naked. I tried to count them as best I could and arrived at the conclusion that all that was mortal of more than 500 men and boys lay there in 2 neat piles. Okay, let's listen to the second excerpt. This excerpt was written several hundred years before Edward R. Murrow's paragraph. It was written by the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. It's from his book, Leviathan. And in this paragraph, Hobbes is going to describe the passions of mankind. So again, listen for voice. Grief for the calamity of another is pity, and arises from the imagination that the like calamity may befall himself, and therefore is called also compassion, and in the phrase of this present time, a fellow feeling. Okay, let's pause. And again, this is shorter, but I want you to listen for those 7 elements that result in voice. So the register, a level of language, allusions, the culture allusions, use of metaphor or literary devices, point of view, the narrative frame, and the tone of the work. So again, grief for the calamity of another is pity, and arises from the imagination that the like calamity may befall himself, and therefore is called also compassion, and in the phrase of this present time, a fellow feeling. Okay, let's think about what we just heard, and let's go on to the next slide, and let's analyze voice. So in Murrow's The Liberation of Buchenwald from 1945, let's look a minute and just see in each of the 7 components of voice what we heard. So one, he is describing the concrete, and he uses standard English. So he's not at the top of the ladder of abstraction. He's right there at the very bottom, describing exactly what he saw. He uses the first person. He begins the paragraph with we, and the subject of his last sentence is I. His words, his descriptions, his frame of reference come from common experience. We do see a bit of a literary turn in such things as they bled but little, and that was all that was mortal of more than 500 men and boys. So there's a bit of a literary turn there. So we're hearing an educated voice, but a voice very firmly planted in everyday realities. And then his metaphors, his use of literary devices. He uses the simile like cordwood, very straightforward. There's nothing poetic about that. And he's drawing from a picture that in 1945, where many, many homes were still heated by coal and firewood, potbelly stoves, that pile of cordwood piled out in the lawn would be a very common picture, would immediately call up something that was part of most people's everyday life. Versus then he uses that bled but little and all that was mortal. That's coming from a little different place. That's more of a literary kind of turn of phrase. Fifthly, he is using short and simple sentences. You don't get much shorter than we entered, or it was floored with concrete. So he's using very short and simple sentences, but notice how as he makes his way to the end of the paragraph, he ends with a long and complex sentence. His tone is very objective. He is describing what he sees, and he's putting it in blunt terms. His voice is blunt, but there is an edge of shock in it. But Roy Peter Clark, in your book, he emphasizes that the writing voice isn't neutral, but neither is it focused on itself. So Murrow is not registering his emotions. He's not writing out of what he's feeling internally. He's writing out of what he sees and the emotions that what he sees would evoke in any person that saw the same. And then finally, notice his narrative frame. He begins with the first person, we entered, and he ends with, I tried to count them as best I could. So there's this eyewitness framework. In other words, this is a writer who's very concerned with evidence, with facts, with reality, and with the reality of human experience. Now let's look at the voice that we see emerging from that brief excerpt from Thomas Hobbes' book Leviathan, written in 1641. So about 300 years earlier. So if we were to describe his register level of English, it is abstract. He is at the very top of the ladder of abstraction. and it's very formal English. We would say very academic. Second, it's third person. So there's no I or we here. He is looking at it. He's writing in the third person point of view. That creates distance in the voice. This is someone who isn't involved in what he or she sees. They're looking at it from a distance. They're an observer and not a participant. And then 3, what's his frame of reference here? What's the range, the context of his allusions and the vocabulary he's drawing from? It's all intellectual. It's not coming from the outside world or the natural world. He is completely immersed in the reasoning and the logical faculties operating in his own mind. So the context is the writer's mind. And then, and again, though, it's not emotional, right? There's that third person. He's distanced himself, both intellectually and emotionally, from what he's observing. There are no literary devices being used here. There are no metaphors. There's absolutely none. That says something about the voice. Fifthly, he's using long, compound, and extremely complex sentences. In fact, this whole paragraph is one very, very long, convoluted sentence. It suggests someone who's in their head a lot, and their thinking they're spaghetti thinkers. They start at one end, and who knows where they're going to end up, because one turn leads to another. So extremely complex. 6, his tone is unemotional, uninvolved, objective. There's nothing experiential here at all. It is all mental or cognitive exercise for this writer. And that shows, again, you can see how that's contributing to Hobbes' voice. And finally, what's the framework that he's using? It's definitions. He starts out by defining pity, and he ends up describing a fellow feeling. But he's concerned with defining the thing, with understanding it, but understanding it, his understanding is rooted and seated in his mind, his intellect. He's not engaging experientially with his subject matter. So again, these create a very different voice. Both Murrow and Hobbes are objective. Murrow is a journalist. He was the voice that reported the Blitz of London in World War II for the American public. And Hobbes too, but there's a difference in their objectivity. There's a difference in their voices. One man is looking at the world and he can't help but respond to it. He's not just observing, he is engaged. The other man, no, he has stepped completely out of experience. He's just very dry and analytical. And that comes out in voice. So what does this have to do with your exercises for today's class? I'm asking you to tune your voice. You're going to first you need to read the excerpt from David Foster Wallace's essay on shipping out. I think you're going to really enjoy it. Wallace has a very distinctive voice, and it would be good to think about these 7 components of voice and where do you see these in Wallace's writing. And I want you to choose then 2 or 3 paragraphs from Shipping Out. You can practice reading it aloud and recording it and listening to your recording until you get one that you're satisfied with, and then I'm going to ask you to post that. And then the second thing, and this is the most important, so with Wallace's work, you're just practicing and you're trying to find his voice, not your voice. So when you practice reading that aloud, what you're listening to when you listen to your recordings of those 2 or 3 paragraphs from Wallace, you're listening for his voice. Can you find his voice? Like we did with Murrow, like we did with Hobbes. Okay, same kind of exercise there. You're going to repeat that with David Foster Wallace's essay on shipping out. The second thing is what's really important, though, and that this is the heart of this class. This is what's important. You're going to read aloud, make recordings, read aloud 2 or 3 paragraphs from your own work. And then I want you to listen to your recordings, read it again till you feel like you got it like you want it. And then you're going to post that recording to a discussion board on MyFire, and all of your classmates are going to be able to listen to it. We're all going to listen to each other's recordings, and our response, we can only respond in 2 or 3 words, and they have to be adjectives. So we're listening for the voice. Now, you're not listening to the content. We're listening to the voice. Like, is it an honest voice? Is it an angry voice? Is it an emotional voice? Is it, what's the point of view? Is the point of view first person or third person? What's the complexity of the sentences? Is it complex? Is it nuanced? Everyone, when you listen to your classmates' recordings, just 2 or 3 adjectives off the top of your head. Don't think about it too much, and post those 2 or 3 adjectives to your classmate. And then once we're done with that exercise, I would like each of you to go back and look at what your classmates, the adjectives that they've posted to your recording. Does that jive with you? Does it resonate with you? Are they hearing the same thing you're hearing? Is that the voice you want? Is that what you want people to hear when they listen to what you've written? And if it's not, what are you going to do to change that? Okay, those are the kind of thoughts I want you to think about. This is all about your voice. It's about using the tool of reading aloud and recording those oral readings and listening to them so that we can tune our writing voice.